It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and I was halfway through my coffee when I heard the unmistakable metallic clink-clink of chains on asphalt. Leaning over my porch railing, I spotted a gaggle of HOA members huddled around my brother Tim's prized teal pickup truck. Tim had left it parked in front of my house the night before after dropping off some supplies for my garden. Apparently, this move had angered the HOA gods. "What's this about?" I called out, strolling down my driveway. Karen 2.0, not the original Karen but somehow worse, spun around, clipboard in hand. "This, Mr. Jacobson," she said with the smugness of a cat that just caught a canary, "is an example of a gross violation of HOA standards. Trucks are not allowed to remain on the street overnight. Rules are rules." Never mind that trucks parked on the street were as common as squirrels in this neighborhood. The HOA's crusade against Tim's truck seemed odd even for them. I glanced at the truck. It stood there innocently, gleaming under the morning sun, now wrapped in a thick chain fastened to the nearest street lamp. They'd gone all out. "You chained a vehicle?" I asked, incredulous. "Are you serious?" Karen 2.0 pursed her lips. "That truck is an eyesore until the owner comes forward to remove it. It stays exactly where it is. Consider this a warning to everyone who thinks they can violate HOA policies." Oh, how I wished I had popcorn for what was coming next. Tim arrived around noon, whistling to himself as he came up the driveway. He stopped cold when he spotted his truck and the ridiculous display that had unfolded around it. Several neighbors had gathered on their lawns, whispering and snapping pictures. "What in the—" Tim said, his voice trailing off. "That's what I said," I replied, handing him his favorite iced coffee. "Apparently they find your truck offensive." Tim's face shifted from confusion to amusement. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Here's the thing about Tim that the HOA hadn't anticipated. By day, he looked like any other laid-back guy with jeans and a pickup truck. But by trade, Tim was a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the kind who made entire courtrooms go silent when he so much as raised an eyebrow. "Do they know what I do for a living?" Tim asked, his grin widening. "Oh, I'm pretty sure they're clueless," I said, grabbing my lawn chair. "But please, enlighten them." Tim wasted no time. Striding straight up to Karen 2.0, who had decided to plant herself in a folding chair next to the truck like some kind of self-designated parking warden, he gave her the kind of smile that only spelled trouble. "Afternoon," he said, tilting his hat. "You the one who chained my truck?" Karen 2.0 sniffed and held up her clipboard. "I am enforcing HOA regulations as deemed appropriate by our bylaws." Tim raised an eyebrow, his lawyer mode kicking in. "Appropriate, you say? And you didn't think to notify the vehicle's owner before resorting to excessive measures?" "It's all in the rules," Karen 2.0 snapped, gesturing to her stack of papers. Tim took a moment to glance at the chain and then back at Karen. "I'd like to see the specific section in your bylaws that permits chaining private property to a public street fixture. Because last time I checked, this might border on both property damage and wrongful detention." Karen 2.0's bravado flickered for a moment. "Well, it's standard practice to uphold neighborhood standards." Tim pulled a card from his pocket, flipping it between his fingers, as if savoring the moment. "You're speaking to Tim Jacobson, attorney at law, and I'm pretty sure standard practice isn't going to look good in front of a judge. Would you prefer I involve the police, or should we settle this with a little friendly legal intervention?" Karen 2.0's face turned pale, though she tried to muster a defiant glare. "You wouldn't. Try me." By the next HOA meeting, word had spread. Everyone in the neighborhood turned up, eager to witness what was quickly becoming the showdown of the year. Tim arrived in his sharpest suit, looking more like a trial lawyer ready to crush corporate fraud than the owner of a violating pickup truck. The HOA president, Brady, shuffled his papers nervously as Tim stood to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Tim began, his voice calm but commanding. "Your HOA has taken it upon themselves to chain my legally parked vehicle. Not only is this a gross overreach of authority, but it's also potentially criminal." Karen 2.0 sputtered. "It was for the good of the community." Tim raised a hand to cut her off. "For the good of the community," he repeated, "or for your personal vendetta against anyone who doesn't conform to your misguided vision of what this neighborhood should look like." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Furthermore," Tim continued, "I've reviewed your bylaws and nowhere does it grant the authority to detain or damage personal property. If anything, the HOA has violated municipal codes concerning the misuse of public property. In this case, the street lamp used to chain my truck." Someone at the back of the room whistled. Karen 2.0 sank lower in her seat. It didn't take long for the HOA to cave. Brady, desperate to avoid escalating the matter further, apologized on behalf of the HOA and promised to remove the chain immediately. Tim, magnanimous as always, decided not to press charges, though he left them with a parting gift in the form of a detailed internal memo highlighting all the ways the HOA had screwed up. "Consider it a free consultation," he said with a wink. Karen 2.0 couldn't even look me in the eye when she walked past to unlock the chain herself. With the drama behind us, life in the neighborhood returned to normal. Tim became something of a local legend, with neighbors stopping by to ask for legal advice or just thank him for putting the HOA in its place. The truck? It stayed parked in front of my house for another week, just because we could. And as for Karen 2.0, she resigned from the HOA shortly after, citing personal reasons. Rumor has it she moved to a condo with stricter regulations, where she wouldn't have to deal with meddling lawyers and their troublemaking trucks. Victory, as Tim liked to say, had never looked so sweet. With Karen 2.0's resignation, the neighborhood felt like it had collectively shrugged off a weighted blanket of petty tyranny. The HOA, now leaderless, fell into temporary chaos. Meetings became more like free-for-alls, with neighbors bickering over everything, from flowerbed regulations to the acceptable number of garden gnomes per lawn. But amidst the chaos emerged Mary Ann, a soft-spoken retired teacher with a penchant for homemade pies and an uncanny ability to mediate disputes. By unanimous agreement, and likely everyone's exhaustion with arguing, Mary Ann was voted in as the new HOA president. Mary Ann's first rule of business? Less rules, more community. She rolled her eyes at the clipboard legacy of past leadership and assured everyone that the HOA's main goal moving forward would be creating an enjoyable neighborhood, not a dictatorship. People actually clapped at a meeting. That had never happened before. Meanwhile, Tim's reputation spread like wildfire. He wasn't just the guy who unchained his truck anymore. He was the neighborhood's unofficial problem solver and occasional hero. Mrs. Hargrove was among the first to knock on my door. "I need your brother," she declared, holding up a parking ticket she'd gotten on Main Street. "This thing's a scam." Tim patiently explained that he specialized in corporate law, not parking violations, but eventually spent an evening drafting a letter to the city for her, complete with citations from the municipal code. She brought over 2 apple pies the next day as thanks. Then there was the time Jim from down the block had a dispute with his contractor over a botched kitchen renovation. Tim stepped in, threw around some impressive legal jargon, and somehow got Jim a full refund and an apology. The best part, Tim wasn't even charging anyone. "Consider it pro bono," he'd say with a shrug. "I can't have my favorite neighborhood falling apart." Under Mary Ann's leadership, the HOA tried to repair its broken image. She introduced things like garden strolls and potluck events to foster goodwill. It worked, for the most part, but some remnants of Karen 2.0's reign lingered. Like Brady, the beleaguered HOA secretary, who seemed perpetually caught between his love for rules and his growing fondness for the new relaxed order. "Jake," he sighed one afternoon as I trimmed my hedges, "this whole laid-back HOA thing is giving me an existential crisis." "Maybe you should have been an accountant," I teased, handing him a glass of lemonade. "Less drama, more spreadsheets." Brady groaned. "I just want one meeting where no one shouts about lawn flamingos or garden gnomes." Apparently, Kevin, our lovable new neighbor, had decided his flamingos needed friends, and half the neighborhood was now divided on whether his expanding lawn zoo was charming or horrifying. "I think it's funny," Tim said as we watched Kevin inflate a giant blow-up flamingo for no discernible reason. "At least it's not chains this time." Just as the neighborhood was settling into its quirky but peaceful new normal, a new issue cropped up, literally. It started as a faint rattling sound late at night, but over the weeks, it grew louder and more annoying. "That noise is driving me crazy," Mrs. Lopez complained during one of Mary Ann's new open forum meetings. "It's like marbles rolling in a tin can. I haven't slept properly in days." Others chimed in, agreeing they'd heard the same sound. It seemed to emanate from the general direction of the park, but every time someone tried to investigate, it mysteriously stopped. "Maybe it's haunted," Kevin suggested with a grin. "It's probably just a broken pipe or something," Tim said, always the voice of reason, "but I'll give it a look." And so, Tim and I found ourselves crouched in the park one evening, armed with flashlights, trying to locate the source of the phantom noise. What we found was unexpected. It turned out the noise wasn't pipes or ghosts. It was a rogue electric scooter that had somehow malfunctioned and was stuck in an endless loop of rattling itself into a frenzy. "Where did this thing even come from?" I asked, poking the scooter with a stick. Tim inspected it, his legal brain already spinning. "Looks like one of those city rental scooters. Somehow, it ended up out here and no one's bothered to deal with it." We dragged the offending scooter back to my house and called the city the next day, but when no one showed up to claim it, Kevin decided it was too good of an opportunity to pass up. "I can fix it," he announced, already gathering tools and duct tape. Against all odds, Kevin actually managed to get it working again. The next weekend, he showed up at the potluck riding the scooter, complete with a flamingo plush strapped to the handlebars. "Who says this neighborhood doesn't have charm?" he shouted, zipping around the cul-de-sac. Under Mary Ann's leadership, and with Tim keeping everyone honest, Willow Creek transformed into something better than it had been before. Sure, there were still the occasional disputes. Kevin's lawn zoo eventually expanded to include fake giraffes, much to Brady's dismay. But they were nothing compared to the reign of Karen 2.0. And as for Tim, he continued to win over the neighborhood one legal fix and kind gesture at a time, becoming a beloved figure everyone knew they could count on. If there was one thing we'd all learned, it was this: a community wasn't built on rules and bylaws. It was built on people who cared enough to show up, lend a hand, and maybe even laugh about the absurdity of it all over a slice of Mrs. Hargrove's pie. Everything in Willow Creek had finally settled into a pleasant rhythm. Kevin's flamingo collection had somehow become a community landmark. Brady had mellowed to the point where he only clutched his clipboard during meetings, instead of all the time, and Tim had carved out his niche as the neighborhood's unofficial legal advisor. For once, things were almost suspiciously normal. That's when the moving truck pulled up to 212 Willow Lane. The house at 212 had been vacant for years, its shutters slightly askew, and its peeling paint standing as a reminder of simpler, less competitive HOA days. When the for sale sign came down, it caused quite the buzz. But when the new owner pulled up, everyone fell silent. The car that parked in the driveway wasn't the typical Willow Creek SUV or hybrid. No, this was a sleek, black sports car that practically screamed high-stakes poker games and offshore bank accounts. The man who stepped out was tall, dressed in a crisp suit, and wore sunglasses despite the overcast skies. I bet he's a billionaire, Kevin whispered to me later, peering through his blinds. Or a spy. Oh, maybe both. Tim naturally was unimpressed. He's probably just an accountant, he said, taking a steady sip of coffee. But then strange things started happening. On the first night after the new neighbor moved in, a giant crate arrived on a flatbed truck. The thing was enormous, wrapped in chains, and secured with multiple locks. The delivery driver, who looked as confused as the rest of us, unloaded it onto the new neighbor's driveway. "What do you think it is?" Kevin asked as we watched from the safety of my living room window. "No idea," I said. "Maybe it's furniture." Kevin's eyes widened. "What if it's a tiger?" The new neighbor didn't acknowledge the growing group of onlookers, calmly cutting the chains himself before wheeling the crate into his garage using some kind of industrial dolly. Then the garage door closed, leaving us with nothing but questions. It wasn't long before Willow Creek's curiosity turned into a full-blown neighborhood investigation. Kevin took it upon himself to form the Mystery Investigation Squad, which mostly involved himself, Brady, who'd been dragged along reluctantly, and Angela, the plant whisperer. Their stakeouts, complete with walkie-talkies and night vision goggles Kevin had probably bought on clearance, became the talk of the block. "Did you find anything yet?" I asked Kevin one afternoon. "Nothing concrete," he replied, setting down a clipboard scribbled with cryptic notes like "car left driveway 6 a.m. and crate was heavy, clue, but I'm working on a theory." Meanwhile, Tim rolled his eyes at all of us. "You're going to scare the poor guy off before he even gets a chance to settle in," he said. Still, even Tim couldn't ignore the odd hum that sometimes emanated from 212 late at night, or the faint flickers of strange lights behind the drawn curtains. The tipping point came at one of Mary Ann's now infamous potluck dinners. The new neighbor, who had so far expertly avoided most social gatherings, showed up unannounced carrying a store-bought pie in pristine packaging. "This is it," whispered Kevin as the neighbor walked into the backyard. "We're finally going to get some answers." To everyone's surprise, the mysterious man was surprisingly charming. He introduced himself as Ethan and apologized for not being more involved sooner, citing work obligations. "What kind of work?" Tim asked casually, though I knew him well enough to catch the edge of curiosity in his voice. Ethan simply smiled. "Oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I tinker." Tinker. This guy looked like the kind of person who tinkered with offshore investments or classified government projects. Somehow, Kevin convinced Ethan to give him, Brady, Angela, and me a tour of his garage. What we found was equal parts anticlimactic and mind-blowing. "It's, a workshop?" Brady said, confused. Ethan's garage was meticulously organized, filled with sleek, futuristic-looking tools and gadgets none of us could identify. A partially dismantled motorcycle rested on a lift in one corner, and in another sat the crate, now empty except for what appeared to be a giant 3D printer. "I design prototypes," Ethan explained, as if that cleared anything up. "For what?" Kevin asked. "Oh, consumer tech mostly." Ethan waved a hand nonchalantly. "That crate held parts for an electric scooter I've been working on. City contracts, you know." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Kevin blurted out, "Can you make it pink and give it flamingo wings?" Ethan blinked, then grinned. "I'll see what I can do." Despite Ethan's mysterious aura, he fit into the neighborhood surprisingly well after that. It turned out his consumer tech expertise was something of a goldmine for DIY enthusiasts like Kevin. Within weeks, Ethan had helped him transform the Flamingo scooter into a full-on parade float, complete with LED lights and sound effects. Even Tim warmed up to him after Ethan casually mentioned he'd beaten 1 or 2 HOA bylaws himself in his previous neighborhood. They bonded over stories of bureaucracy combat, Tim's legal battles complementing Ethan's knack for finding loopholes. The hum from Ethan's garage didn't stop entirely, but it stopped bothering us. If anything, it became a quirky part of the neighborhood ambiance. Life in Willow Creek continued to be as delightfully chaotic as always. Ethan became the go-to guy for futuristic gadgets. Tim remained the unofficial lawyer-in-residence, and Kevin's flamingo obsession reached new heights when Ethan helped him install a holographic flamingo that danced across his yard. And me, I kept tending the Survivor, which now had its own miniature picket fence, courtesy of Mary Ann, and watching as our little neighborhood rolled with whatever quirky twist came next. Because one thing was certain about Willow Creek. With neighbors like these, life would never be boring.